I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's a pleasure to kick off this evening's discussion with Rachael Cerrotti and Ellen Bachner Greenberg. We are here to celebrate the launch of Rachael Cerrotti's new memoir, We Share the Same Sky, a memoir of memory and migration, released 3 weeks ago from Blackstone Publishing, which documents Rachael's decade-long journey to retrace her grandmother's Holocaust survival story. Rachael is an award-winning photographer, writer, educator, and audio producer, and the inaugural Storyteller in Residence for the USC Shoah Foundation. She's a leading voice focused on Holocaust memory in the third generation. This evening's program is co-hosted with Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, which is a New York-based group for children and other descendants of survivors to connect with each other, to share thoughts, feelings, and memories, and to learn and teach about the legacy of the Holocaust together. Ellen Bachner Greenberg, who's in conversation with Rachael this evening, is the co-founder of Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, along with Eva Vogelman, and is a leading voice for Holocaust memory in the second generation. So we're so glad to have them both with us. As they get into this evening's discussion, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end of the hour. If you feel inspired or intrigued by their discussion, you can order We Share the Same Sky at the link in the Zoom chat. Without further ado, welcome Rachael and Ellen. Feel free to get started.
Great. Ari, thank you again for hosting us and allowing us to participate in this wonderful program, and for all the programs that you do for us and for the rest of the museum. Rachael, it's a pleasure to talk with you. We've spoken before on the phone, and now we are face to face in the COVID world. But so let's start beginning off by telling about your story, your book, and your grandmother Hannah, who was a Holocaust survivor, and tell us about her life as a Holocaust survivor. I know she was born in a little town not far from Prague, Czechoslovakia, and tell us about how she lived there and how she ended up in Denmark.
Sure. So first of all, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Ari. So my grandmother, Hanna Dubova, was born in Kolín, Czechoslovakia in 1925. When she was 1 year old, she moved to Prague with her family, which was just before her younger brother was born. So she really grew up in a, very modern household, you could say. It was urban, diverse, fairly secular, like culturally Jewish. She always said, when she and I started talking when I was in college, she really related to me and saying it was similar to how I grew up, where it was very culturally Jewish, gathered together for the family meals, but didn't necessarily keep kosher. But her Jewish identity really came through the Zionist youth movement, which she joined as a preteen, I guess you could say. And that was where she found all her friends. At that time, schools in Czechoslovakia didn't have like sports programs and extracurriculars the way that we do now. So that was really where they got that type of exercise and socialization. And then by the time 1939 comes and Czechoslovakia is occupied by the Nazis and World War II is breaking out, my grandmother was very lucky, and she called it a lottery ticket, where she was able to get out of occupied Czechoslovakia to Denmark in October of 1939, so about a month and a half after the war begins, and is able to go with a rescue mission, is what I call it. I would say it's like akin to the kinder transport, but not the kinder transport, but that helps people kind of understand, where it was for Czech Jewish teens between the ages of 14 and 16 who were being sent to Denmark to learn agricultural skills with intention to eventually go on to Palestine. And so that's how she makes her way out of Prague and essentially ends up, starts the story of her becoming the only survivor in her family.
Now, it's really interesting because many of us know a lot about the history of the Holocaust, but there's a wonderful story behind the Danish people, and that 95% of the Jews were saved, and it wasn't mandated. It was everyday people wanting to do this on their own. So if you could talk a little bit about your grandmother, the Danish people that saved her, and what it was like there for her.
Yeah, so a lot of my work is rooted in Denmark, both from a historical perspective as well as from my own experience, because this memoir really blends together my grandmother's journey with my own journey throughout my 20s, following her story across Europe as well as across the United States. And Denmark and Scandinavia in general is, I would say, it's where life lives in this story still to this day. So, in general, we could sit here and do a whole history lesson on Denmark, which I'm going to refrain from doing, but I really love the history of Denmark. And it's not only my mom's side, because this is my maternal grandmother, but my father's mother was actually born in Copenhagen. So I have a Danish connection on both sides of my family. And so yeah, Denmark in general was a fairly light occupation, as you could say, and there's a number of reasons for that were, Denmark was a leading producer of food, which is very important in wartime. It had, people looked Aryan. There's a lot of reasons for why Hitler was a little bit lighter on Denmark as a country as let's say Poland or Czechoslovakia. And I'm going to skip the history lesson for now, but the important thing to know is that for those early years of the war, my grandmother was living a relatively normal life. And, nothing was normal about the time, but in comparison to what other people were facing, she was well fed, she had a home, and she was treated for the most part with respect. So every 6 months, this cohort of Czech teens that were brought to the Danish countryside were moving from one home to another, essentially foster homes. And they were supposed to go on to Palestine fairly quickly. That did not happen because as the war, continued, travel routes, it was just not as easy. And so every 6 months they were moving to different families. And so my grandmother, I'm very lucky that this whole project is really based off this beautiful archive that she left behind after she passed away. And it wasn't a secret archive. It was just her memories that she kept and valued to the end of her life. And she has some of the diaries from those early years of the 1940s. And so that's how I know a lot of this, as well as her own personal storytelling. But depending what home she was in, her experience during war really changed. And what I really love about that is, she was in a family where she was really treated as a servant. And, how she felt about her life during this wartime as a teenage refugee was very different than when she would move to the home where they treated her as part of the family. And, as a third generation, what I really love drawing out of that type of memory that was passed down is just how impactful the way somebody treats you in day to day has on recently I've been doing a lot of work on spiritual resistance. So I just want to use that word, but for this feeling of, empowerment during a really scary, dangerous time. And so that was one of the lessons I took away from that. But then moving forward to 1943, which is when Denmark was no longer safe for the Jews, there was this incredible rescue operation. And Ellen, as you mentioned, Denmark ends up saving 95% of their Jewish population by illegally ferrying them to Sweden in the matter of, just about roughly around 3 weeks. And it was really an operation that was the ground up. This did not come from the top down, and that's really important. And so my grandmother was able to get on one of the very last boats out of Denmark in October. And so by the time she's 18, she was freshly 18 at that time, she's now a refugee twice over, and this time in Sweden. And that's where she spends the rest of the war.
Right. And these are just everyday people with boats who just out of the kindness of doing the right thing did this. I want to share with you a picture of the Girder 3, which is not the boat that that Hannah, who is Rachel's grandmother, was on, but this is a boat that was gifted by the Danish Parliament to the Museum of Jewish Heritage that is now on display in Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. So this would be a typical boat, and your grandmother was underneath on top under herring, right? Lots of fish.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know exactly what the boat looked like on that day for her, but I do know that a lot of my grandmother's story and the way she told it was really elevating the unsung heroes. So individuals whose names she couldn't tell me, whose legacy or history she couldn't necessarily retell me. But for example, the fishermen that ferried her to Sweden, taking these boats was really, really expensive, just as it is for refugees today trying to get across the Mediterranean. And my grandmother had no money. She had no money. She had nothing. And she has, a big part of her story is, she's getting all the signals to run to the shore in this kind of very, wasn't middle of the night, but in the darkness event. And she gets to this boat and she, empties her pockets and says, I have no money. And her now better Danish that had gotten better over the years. And the fisherman says to her, I didn't ask you, hop on board. And it was such a pivotal part of her story because, all the other people on board had to pay a lot of money. And whether it was pity or kindness, it doesn't matter. She was able to be let on. And so her story is very much speckled with a lot of those acts of kindness.
What's really neat about your book is several things. First of all, it's your grandmother's journey. It's through her personal records, her diary, conversations with her, and it's also your journey. We'll get into that. But, I was thinking about it. Typically when somebody's doing research and they're writing a book, they bring the research to them. They sit at home, everything's at our fingertips. Not Rachael. Rachael takes all the documents, the diaries, and goes and follows her grandmother's journey from Prague, Denmark, Sweden, and then back when she gets into the United States, you take a train cross country. That makes your book so rich with understanding of your grandmother's experience and your own. So your book would have been very different had you sat home at the keyboard.
Yeah, and it started, I started this project when I was 20 years old and I was very discontent in college. Like all I knew is I wanted to be a photojournalist and I knew my grandmother had this incredible story and I knew she was near the end of her life. And so, over the years, it's been, a dozen years now since I started it. And it's taken a lot of different shapes. So for the first 4 years, it was me sitting at home and digitizing and retyping and learning and meticulously going through her diaries and saying, okay, she was in this train station here and these were the people, and essentially like webbing the whole thing together, building out a timeline. And then I left. So there definitely has been large chunks of me sitting at my computer or sitting on the floor, but yeah.
Sure, but you could have easily corresponded with the people. You could have seen pictures of where she went, but being there, I really think adds to it. And when you talk about going to Sobibor, the place that your family, your grandmother's brother and her parents were shot and murdered. And there's nothing there, just the remnants when you go, but there's something just about the trees and everything that you can feel it, that you can never get in a picture. And when I was in Poland, in Treblinka, there's something about those trees. They were sad, they were pain, they could talk. And so your story of meeting those people who knew your grandmother and their descendants, enables you to I think have a much deeper understanding.
Yeah, and something that was, I approached this story as I wanted to tell the story of memory. So I wasn't so interested in going into all the archives in Europe and finding out exactly on what day this happened. I mean, right. I find that stuff important, but that wouldn't have sustained my interest for all these years, to be honest. And I was really interested in how the story gets passed from one generation to the next. So yeah, in Denmark, I went and I moved in with the granddaughter of my grandmother's foster mother from World War II. And so I got to live with their family for over the course of 3 years, quite a bit of time for a variety of different circumstances. And, I spent significant time in the home of the descendants of the Swedish fishermen that helped my grandmother in 1943. And a lot of time with Rabbi Ben Melchior, who recently passed away, who was a huge part of my storytelling. And returning to these people over and over again, not only, I guess, put me in the story, which I can't say was super intentional, but just was so natural. But also it allowed for this conversation that kept happening of what did they hear? And when I went out and started following my history, I think like many of us, I was very possessive about it. This is my family history and this is what happened to us. And it was very much like kind of this narrow perspective of it happened to us, and going out and hearing how this Danish family is passing the story from one generation to the next. And they said in their family, it was a good story because they helped save somebody. And same in this family, the fisherman family in Sweden. I mean, their whole house felt like a museum, really like a museum to this history. And, they weren't Jewish and they weren't victims, but it was such a core part of their family history, that they were part of this rescue effort. And that really changed the way I understood my history. And yeah, it made this story much more, it made it alive.
Yeah.
It's still very, very alive. And that's a lot of what the book becomes about.
And my guess is when you sat down and first interviewed your grandmother back in 2009, you would never have envisioned that this would have become the huge life that it has become, right?
If anybody told me I was starting a decade-long project, there was no way I would have signed up for that. I mean, you know, and it's not even like, it's not just like I was doing this project for all these years, like it really became my life. And it became very much like the lens in which I saw not just my own life unfold, but also the world around me and politics. And so it really, yeah, it's really shaped it. But no, it was not intentional, nor could I have, I couldn't have planned
it, right?
Yeah.
When you talk about the lens, and yes, this is your grandmother's story, it's your story, it's interwoven, and it's also through your lens. And I'll use some terms here that Rachael is a 3G. She's the granddaughter of survivors. I am the 2G. I'm the daughter of survivors. And there's a very different lens between 3G and a 2G. And very early on in the book, you talk about your mother, that the difference between you embracing this and diving into it, and your mother who's sort of stepping back.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say she's stepping back, but you know, my mother and, you know, kind of the family, this is sort of known information in our family. My mom was the middle of 3 children, and she really was the one that you could say absorbed, I don't know if I would say necessarily just the trauma, but really absorbed the history in a very
the impact.
Yeah, in a very emotionally intimate way. And so both my parents are very into family history. So the apple didn't fall far from the tree here. Right. But it also meant that my mom and I went to a few places over the years. We've gone to a number of these places in Europe together. And very early on, when I was still kind of like, you know, early mid 20s, which is a very different perspective I have on the world now in my 30s. You know, I remember us going back to Colleen together, to this town where my grandmother was, and all these, you know, we really were there as like living memorials for people in this town. We were there for an event. We were brought by the mayor, and all these journalists were asking us questions about how does it feel to be back in this town. And yeah, there was a, you know, my mom and I still talk about it a lot. There was this very distinct difference of how heavy she felt. And almost, I was in this place where I was just starting to get really into this work and just starting to travel. And I was like, wow, this is kind of cool to be back here. And we've talked, you know, I think I actually haven't been back to Czech Republic in a number of years. And I think now that I've spent so many years immersed in Holocaust education, Holocaust history, I might not use those same words, and I might feel it in a much deeper way. But you know, I love that I can talk about it with her, because it is different. And she's made me feel very comfortable in the fact that she wants me to feel different about it. She doesn't want me to carry it the way she does. And that's some of what I explore also in this work.
Right. I mean, it's very different for many reasons. You know, those of us, you know, children born in the 1950s, you know, our parents were, you know, 10 years out of the, you know, since liberation. Talking about the Holocaust was really taboo. Nobody wanted to hear about it. And, you know, the impact was still very much alive. They hadn't processed it. You know, I know with my children, my 3Gs, just as with you, it's kind of neat to talk to your grandmother about this. It's neat to know the history, and the pain isn't there. So if your mother had done this story or wanted to, it'd be a very different story.
Oh yeah, she wouldn't. I mean, we've talked about it. She wouldn't be able to. And then, you know, I also want to bring up the fact that, you know, my grandmother's story, particularly as she retold it, was filled with examples of kindness and almost this uplifting of strangers. And, you know, she just as easily could have told me a story that was, you know, it was an incredibly heavy story, but I would say much scarier. She didn't spend a lot of time telling me about her parents and her brother's death. I mean, partly because she wasn't there, right? So I have peers of mine who are 3G who perhaps grew up with the memory of Auschwitz from all of their grandparents. And so they're getting a very different inheritance than I am, where I'm getting this inheritance of, look at these people who saved me, look at this kindness of strangers, look at the rescue of the Danish Jews, 95, that's a really different story. And so I think I talk about that with my peers as well, of like, there are individuals my age who can't touch this because they inherited a different piece of this history.
Right. Yes. So the beauty of your grandmother's story is it's not only just about the Holocaust, it's about the joy and the impact and what you can do later on. It doesn't have to just be drowning in the sorrow. And your grandmother really focused on that. What's interesting is when we tell stories, when anyone tells stories, if I tell you a story, we don't always tell the same exact story the same way. And it's not because the facts change, it's just what we pick and choose to tell that particular time might be dependent on what we think the person wants to hear, how we're feeling, what's going on in the world. If your grandmother had told the story to one of her other grandchildren, would it have been a different story? Were there certain messages you think she gave just to you?
Well, it's funny because now with the podcast came out a couple of years ago, and some, there's 7 of us grandchildren, and so my cousins listen to that. But a book is different. It's like, and the book is like a much more in-depth telling of the story. And so my cousins are just reading it now, as are like my aunts and uncles. And so this is like, I always tell them they're my scariest critics, because I'm just like, I've just been so immersed in our grandmother's life and took on this story and told it. And so what's been really neat is that I was actually talking to my cousin's wife this morning about this, that they're picking out things and being like, oh yeah, she totally would have said it this way. So I'm getting a lot of like feel goods of just like, okay, I think I told her the way that we remember her in some regards. But I'll say that a number of years ago, when I was able to watch the testimony that my grandmother gave to Shoah Foundation, which I didn't know existed until a number of years into this research, and I watched this 4.5-hour audiovisual testimony. And when I interviewed my grandmother, I don't know why I didn't, but I only typed. I didn't record it with audio. I didn't do it visual, mostly because we were just hanging out, and it was a very informal retelling of her story. And a lot of what, a lot of the questions that the interviewers at Shoah Foundation would ask, any survivor of like, why, once you get to the end in this reflection, it was very similar to what I was already interested in and what I was, so they ask her at one point, they say, I forget which question it was, but, what do you want people to take away from your story? Something along those lines. And, she says, I want to know what good people can do. And she's talking about the rescue of the Danish Jews. She's saying, I want people to know what a difference people can make. And she has this great line. She's like, I don't know if I'm like, hitting my head against a wall, telling this to students over and over and over again about like what a difference people can make in the good too. And then the last thing I'll say about that is my grandmother was an incredibly gifted storyteller. Her writing is throughout this whole book. Her diaries are beautiful. Like even as a teenager, she just wrote so poetically. And one of her gifts as a really good storyteller is that, she was very vocal. She spoke in schools and classrooms and communities and synagogues and all the like. And she told the story to her audience as they could relate to it. So she would speak differently to a group of 4th graders or 7th graders or college kids than she would to adults or her own peers. And I like to think that I've learned a little bit from her in that sense, because it is really important. You need to meet your audience where they're at, particularly if you really want them to feel the story. And my grandmother just was so gifted at that naturally.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I know she'd be proud of you. Now it's really interesting that, I understand your grandmother had her diaries. Okay, let's say that she had them with her. The fact that your grandmother had letters that she had written to her family, any idea how she got possession of those letters?
Like the greatest question I'll never be able to answer. So, I mean, I have theories, but archive. So for anyone who's not familiar with this, the timeline here is that in 2009, 2010, I was doing these storytelling sessions with my grandmother, and then she passed away in October 2010. And I was going into my senior year of college, or I was in my senior year of college at that point. And over the years that followed, as I got deeper and deeper into her story, I just kept, as we're cleaning out her apartment and all the things you do when someone you love passes away. She just left behind this incredible, like, oh my gosh, it's just incredible. You said diaries and letters and papers and diaries from when she was 14, and then diaries from when she was in her 70s, where you mentioned earlier, the retelling is different even to yourself. We all do that for ourselves. And so amongst this treasure trove were these letters that she sent to her parents during the war from Denmark, and that her parents sent back to her, and that my mom and I eventually got translated. And my best educated guess is that she kept hers from her parents, and that perhaps when she went back to Prague after the war was over to see who and what was left, there were enough distant family members, distant relatives, a few here and a few there, that they were left in someone's home, and she was able to retrieve them. And I have to believe that's how she got the photo albums as well. But it's one of those things that I just didn't know this archive existed till she passed away. So, and I also don't know if I would have, at that young of an age, really had like the foresight to sit down and look at it and say, how did you get all this stuff? Like I was very much in my own world and not in her world at that point.
Yeah, I think that's common. We all have, when you take something for granted. I have my grandmother's yellow star. Well, my grandmother was hiding in somebody's house. How did I get her yellow star? She went to, so all those kinds of questions. The technical question we don't know, and it doesn't matter. But aside from that, if you had to ask your grandmother a question, now you've read her intimate secrets and all that, what would you want to ask her?
Well, I pose this in both the podcast and the book, is that I'd be really curious to talk to her about how often she lied about her past, because she has this really beautiful line in this letter that she writes when she's, gets to America. She immigrates to America in 1950, and she's crossing the country by train, and there's a whole story there. And she writes this letter from San Francisco back to a friend in Cincinnati, and she's telling her about this whole train trip across the country. And she says that she met a nice gentleman in one of the cars of the train, and he asked where she was going, and she lied and said that she was going to meet family on the West Coast. And she said she thought it'd be quite odd if she told him the truth. And that has always just sat with me, and particularly as I've gone through certain tragedies in my own life, wondering how often did she just not tell the truth? How often did she feel compelled to give this very light version of her life in order to protect other people? And so that's a question that I don't think I'll ever stop being curious about. And also, how did that feel? Was that okay? Did that feel all right? Or did it create a burden to not be able to just be honest with who she was and where she was coming from and where she was going?
Or maybe she was just able to discern and read the audience. Sometimes, she spoke to students. Sometimes it's okay to say, and sometimes, oftentimes when people say, "How are you?" they don't really want to hear your whole saga, how you are. So, maybe it was the same thing. She just was easy to play it light. I'm going to, rather than.
And we all do that, right?
Yes.
We all, we tell ourselves the stories that we need to hear, and we tell other people the stories that we feel, capable of telling in that moment. And sometimes you tell some stranger your whole life story, and sometimes you get a one-word answer. So I'd just like to explore that topic with them.
Right. Okay. And there's this whole journey. It's the intersection of your grandmother's journey, and then, during this period between when you were 20 and 32, I believe you are now, you've been on your own journey. And there's sort of this intersection of you learning and pulling from your grandmother's experience. In many ways, it brings her alive because she's there kind of with you. So what are some of the things that you learned from her that helped you through your times?
Yeah. So a big part, so say the story kind of has a before and after in terms of in 2016, my husband passed away, and that was a very, how do I say it? Very
Tragic.
deep. Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
what word do you want to choose, right? And my husband, I had met, his name was Sergio, and I had met him in Israel. We were study abroad students together. He was from Poland. And so he was a really big part of my ability to be in Europe, and not just from a logistical point of view, but also from an emotional point of view. And he had his own family history. So he brought a lot of perspective as somebody who wasn't Jewish, whose family also suffered during World War II, and also was somebody, a European, who was very interested in it. And so I would say, like, it returned to me this European identity becoming a part of his family that really, had an impact on the way that I understood my grandmother's story. And then when he passed away, I had already been immersed in my grandmother's story for 7 years or so at that point. And it was like this awakening that I didn't understand it at all. So, I thought I was kind of done by the time he was going to immigrate to America and we got married. And, I was like, very naively, it was like, I'm going to travel for a year and then write a book, and we're coming up on the 5-year yard site of his death now. And the book has just come out. But the book entirely changed. The story changed, it completely changed in the sense that I started rereading my grandmother's diaries. I started retracing her steps again. I returned to all these people that I had met along the way.
Right.
This new perspective, but also I was starting to understand her words in a way, like I could see the grief differently because I just hadn't
experienced
it. Yeah, and I didn't know how to touch it, and that wasn't me being a good or bad journalist. That was just me not having the ability to see it at that point. And Rabbi Bent Melchior would always talk about how, our senses are limited, and so we can only see a certain distance, and we can only hear to a certain sound. And we would talk about that in the sense of grief too. Like you can only understand so much when you understand it. And so in that sense, my grandmother's story became like this lifeline for me. And now the way I see her story is like, her story is such a lesson in how to be empowered by your grief. My grandmother, I know her as being the liveliest, most alive human. I mean, she always said she won she had like the gift of life, and she really lived that. And as a grandchild, she was like hilarious and just energetic and hyped and this, and she dyed her hair green for my bat mitzvah and always would make us laugh. And she just was such a character. And then to start to be able to see the grief, which came years after I started digging into the history, really layered on something different. And it also, so that was what was happening in my personal life that really impacted how I both saw and how I tell this story. But then you also, around that time, around 2015, you have the refugee crisis breaking out, and you have, thousands and thousands of refugees and migrants flooding Scandinavia. And so you're seeing a lot of these conversations happening again. You're seeing young people crossing to safety by boat. And that became a really big interest of mine. And I started doing a lot of reporting with young people in Scandinavia who were seeking refuge. And so that also, I was seeing that through the lens of my grandmother's story.
So you're back in Scandinavia, I believe, even in the house where your grandmother had stayed with refugees. It's sort of full circle again.
Yeah, and I always said that I think in the early years of this project, I really saw it as being like history as being this very linear thing. There was
sure
feeling of being on the train, crossing from, going from Prague through Germany to Denmark by boat, because I was very intentional about traveling the same way my grandmother did, and doing all the route and retracing, and thinking, oh, nobody's checking my passport, nobody cares who I am, nobody, and then even after the refugee crisis breaks out, passport checks become a thing, but nobody really cares about who I am. And so you start to see our present day through the lens of the past, and certain things feel different, and you have to confront them really differently. And so my grandmother's story really became a vehicle for understanding what was happening in our world today.
Right. In your personal world, in your life, and also in the world. I guess when you spend enough time on a project, there's enough different cycles.
Cycles, yes.
Yeah. There's a part I'd like you to read from the book, and you traveled many times to all these different countries and across the US. And as you said, very meticulous, the same train, the same place, to really recreate as best you could your grandmother's experience. There's a part where we start off in the book, as we said before, that you and your mom are back in where your grandmother had lived in Prague, and you find it really great, neat that your mother's hesitant. And now let's go to the part where you're back in Prague.
Yeah, so this part that I'm about to read is from, let me think, this is around November 2014. And so I'm in September 2014, I relocated to Europe. So I'm not with my mom here. I'm spending 5 weeks living in Prague in a woman's home who was part of the Jewish community, who was my age, and she let me live in her spare bedroom. And I was essentially just trying to understand Prague from my grandmother's point of view. So I felt like an intruder in Prague. Hitler envisioned the city as a museum to the Jewish people, a place dedicated to what he had destroyed, or in his eyes, what he had built. On some days, I felt like he had succeeded. While there, I was hosted by a young woman who was kind enough to let me live in her spare bedroom. She was one of the few of my generation who was active in the Czech Jewish community. I never felt comfortable in her apartment, but then again, I never felt comfortable in the country. These were the days when no one asked who I was, where I was going, or where I was coming from. This was the place where grief and ghosts took me by the hand. At night, I would sit on a weak wooden chair and edit whatever pictures I had taken that day. I had a twin bed that was more like a cot, squeezed next to a black wooden desk. My pillow was small but functional, its case printed with classic pink roses. I stacked my clean clothes on a piano in the corner of the room and kept the rest of my belongings hidden in my backpack. Dusty books lined the shelves. They were old but held modern ideas for their time. The room's window was partially covered by a shower curtain, and the panels of naked glass showed my bare reflection every time I changed my clothes. I fell asleep to the sounds of the former Czechoslovakia playing a melody outside. The country sowed chaos in my subconscious. My dreams scarred me with their stories. In one dream, I was back in Boston. My friends were too busy to care that I had come back. They literally looked right through me, as if I were a ghost in my own home. The only one who recognized me was my sweet dog, who nestled her head into my chest and took my finger into her mouth, like a teething child seeking the security of its mother. I often woke up with a jolt, my skin sweaty. I would turn to the right and face the wall, then to the left and stare at my backpack. I would touch one foot with the other and tell myself that I was okay. The nightmares got progressively worse as my time in Prague went on. I remember one night I woke up certain that the building was on fire. I ripped the blanket off, drew my knees to my chest, and rocked back and forth like the men I had seen in prayer at the synagogue the previous week. I took one breath after another until the sun rose and day broke. During the days, I learned to fear the city more and more. Prague stopped being new and exciting. I stopped feeling curious about what people were saying in Czech and began to feel more sensitive, nearly angry when I heard people speaking in English. I didn't want to hear their thoughts. I resented the conversations they had with friends over coffee and cake as I sat alone nearby, staring at my computer, reading and rereading my grandmother's words. I had such a creepy feeling, and I really, really didn't want to stay, she had said about being back in Prague. But I had nobody in Denmark. I had nobody in Sweden.
Yeah. It's really a shift there in how you felt in many other places.
Yeah, it's I have a very complicated relationship with Prague for this reason. Like I said when we started chatting, in Denmark and in Sweden, but particularly in Denmark, there's just so much life there of this story. And in Prague or in Czech Republic, I find my family's names on all the walls of the deceased. And there's not this type of energy to remember the past. In Denmark, there's this energy to remember the past. There's this pride in doing the right thing. And that is not something I felt in Prague. And so it's complicated for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sure. When there's good things to remember and noble things that people want to remember that. And Prague was the beginning of the darkness when your grandmother had to leave. So.
Yeah, and just for my own mental health, it's gentler to sit with the more uplifting story,
Sure.
right? Like, it feels better, right? It's really hard to work on the really, painful, nearly unbelievable stories that existed all throughout Europe, right? And so, we're drawn to the things that make us feel better. So
right.
I could say that's why, perhaps for my grandmother as well, that's why we spent so much time focusing on the moments of light.
Right, the moments of light, which is how you describe that she lived her life. That with the green hair and the playing around, and that she was light and airy, not dark and heavy. So I'm going to turn to some questions. We have and pick out some questions, combining a few. Can you discuss the Czech rescue network that your grandmother was a part of, and which Zionist group was that a part of? Was it the Bundes, or was it religious or secular? And also these host families, how were they chosen?
Yeah, so my grandmother was part of the Chalutzim, so it was more of like a secular cultural group. Mm-hmm. She wasn't very religious. So they were the pioneers that were going out there. And the organization that helped them get to Denmark was the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So it was a women's organization. And so a lot of the families that were all in the countryside who took in these kids were all, these women were participants of this organization, which I also love, that this story is just completely driven by powerful women doing the right thing. So that's certainly something that I really love about this story as well.
Right. I believe this is Ken. Are you able, or do you want to move on from this story now? The book has been published. Are you going to do more work on this, or do you have any other projects in line?
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm ever going to get away from this story totally. I will say it feels very good that the book is done, because particularly because it's like a weaving of past and present. There really is no time when the story's over. And I think a lot of documentarians who work on long projects feel this way. But, I started this project as a photojournalist. Somewhere in between, I became a podcaster and made a podcast about this, now the book. And, I always joke now that probably the last thing I'll do with this project is some visual type of storytelling, whether that's thinking about a movie or a photo book, or I don't know. I got ideas percolating as every creative does. But I have the pleasure now of working with Shoah Foundation as their storyteller in residence. So I get to work with other people's family stories every single day from the Visual History Archive at Shoah Foundation. And right now I have a podcast that I co-host with Stephen Smith, who's the executive director of the Institute, that's called The Memory Generation. That comes out once a month. And so we dig into family stories and the inheritance of memory, and the way technology plays into it, and just all different topics. So, in many ways, my grandmother's story has given me this opening to work with other family histories. And I like to think that working with other family histories helps give some context to my own. And so it's this kind of beautiful web of stories that I get to engage with on a daily basis.
Well, clearly for the rest of your life, your grandmother's story and is interwoven in your life. And
absolutely. And I say that, I don't have kids and I don't have grandkids. And so I have to believe that if I ever have that privilege in life, that I'm going to go back to my grandmother's diaries and be like, oh my God, there's so much I missed. Or like, there's this beautiful letter that she wrote to her mother on what would have been her mother's 100th birthday. And it's a really beautiful but painful letter. And it was one of the first pieces of writing I ever fell in love with. And it didn't make it into the book because that wasn't really resonant with any part of my life. And so I actually really look forward to life experiences, I don't want to say bad life experiences, but complicated and easy and good and all the things that where I get to go back and lean on her words in a different way. She left a gift, and I'm not letting go of it.
Right. Maybe at some point They'll share that letter because your grandmother, the last time she saw her mother was 14, right?
Yeah, and she particularly speaks beautifully about her mother around the time she's giving birth. And as she's becoming a grandmother and thinking and reflecting about how her mother never had that. And so, I'm very aware that that's something that I can't resonate with right now. Whereas other cousins of mine, one of my cousins who's a few years older than me, who has a child, when she was reading the early part of the book that, tells the story of the separation between my grandmother and her mother, she was able to resonate with that or feel that in a way that I can't at this moment. I can get it intellectually, but I can't.
Right. There's something about having to experience that yourself. Yeah, I grew up my mother saying that, my grandmother saying, can you imagine what it was like, giving your children to strangers? And no, I couldn't imagine it until I had children. So that's why it'll always sort of be part of you. We think the book is great. Somebody would like to know, what kind of response have you gotten from people about the book and the podcast?
So far, so good. So that feels great.
So.
The podcast came out 2 years ago. It's also titled We Share the Same Sky. And that was really special to put out because for all these years I've been doing this work and no one really understood what I was doing, like even my own family. Like, it's a really bold statement to be like, I'm going to sublet my apartment, pack a backpack, take all my camera gear and like go retrace my grandmother's story and like not recreate it, but retrace it. And like, people, I didn't even really know what I was doing, until it kind of happened. And so the podcast coming out was kind of like this exhale of like, see, I was doing this thing.
Some sort of validation that you were doing something.
Yeah. And also I was building all these beautiful relationships with all these people intersected, with my history, whether they knew my grandmother or, one of their ancestors knew my grandmother. And it was really nice to be able to introduce those people to everybody else in my life, so to speak. And so the book certainly has that. And the book is like a much deeper dive into the story. It's a much more complicated, much more, extended version of it. Like I said earlier, my family has been my scariest critic, particularly my cousins, because, I'm writing this as a grandchild. So there's only 6 other humans in this world who knew my grandmother as a grandmother growing up. And so their opinions have been kind of the scariest to receive feedback on. It's been beautiful and it's been wonderful because they've been telling me memories that I didn't know. And so it's like she's here with us. And so that's been wonderful. And so, yeah, all positive. The book's been out for 3 weeks. So hopefully more good to come.
Let's talk about the title. We Share the Same Sky. Who's the we and how did you come up with the title?
Yeah, so the we is all of us, right? Not to be too much about it, but it really is. And the title is actually thanks to my mother-in-law, Sergio's mom, Danuta in Poland, who I'm still incredibly close with to this day. And about 3 months after my husband passed away, I was in Poland. It was around Christmas time, and it was like 2 a.m, and we were up talking late into the night and sharing stories. And she was telling me that, my Sergio, my husband, was like, he was super international. Like, we met in Israel, he studied in London, like he was going to immigrate and be with me in America. And she said to me that every time he went abroad, she would tell him, it's okay because we share the same sky. And the story is a little bit longer than that. And there's a version of it in the podcast and version of it in the book. But yeah, and as soon as she said those 5 words to me, because the project was kind of going by a different name at that time. And as soon as she said those 5 words to me, I was like, that's it. And like, I was like, that's the name of the book. And then the podcast came into existence. So that's the name of the podcast. And it's become more than just a title for all of us. It's become really this kind of these words to live by. And I would say particularly in this time of the pandemic, I haven't seen them now in going on 2 years, and a lot of stuff has happened, good and bad, in that time. And, oftentimes we repeat to each other, it's okay, we share the same sky. And it's this thing to hold on to.
Strengthen. Yeah.
It's strength in words. And so that's the title is thanks to Danuta Scheller.
Beautiful story. And also keeps Sergio connected with you as well. So it's not just you and your grandmother sharing it, it's embracing it.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, this is fiction in my head, but I love to, I like to believe that Hannah's parents, my grandmother's parents, were saying similar words to her, whether they were out loud or in their head. So I just, as well as all the people who are, trying to get to their loved ones today, who are separated from loved ones, whether it be, war or weather or whatever the crisis is, something to hold on to.
Yeah, it certainly is enough going on in the world. And certainly recent news, Afghanistan, you always come back to your book when you hear the news. I imagine it's very much part of your life.
Absolutely. And I'll say that actually in the book, there's a small section about these two boys who I was doing some documentary work with in Sweden after the refugee crisis, named Hadi and Madi, who came over when they were 11 years old on their own to Sweden. And I tell kind of the story of the relationship between them and the woman who was taking care of them. So almost like this paralleling in some sense, or this connection in some sense, to my grandmother being taken in, by these people in Denmark. And I'm not going to go into their whole story, but something that's really beautiful about it is that they were originally Afghani, and then they came through Iran and up to Sweden with all the migrants. And they hadn't seen their father in years. They were separated at the Afghan border when their family was escaping. And after, I think it's like close to 10 years, they just found the father, and they just saw him again for the first time. And so, it's like, in theory, that has nothing to do with my grandmother's story, but by being interested in my grandmother's story, I got to meet these young people, and I got to be a part of their lives, and I got to photograph them for a couple of years. And so, I like to think the title kind of binds us all in some way.
It does. And, the interesting thing is that your grandmother had connections with these people who were a generation older than her and her generation, and you had connections with that generation, and now the generation after that, and you internationally, it's a whole incredible connection that is a very much a big part of this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the building of relationships. And I love that the children of the farm family that I moved in with in Denmark, who was the, farm is owned by the granddaughter of my grandmother's foster mother from World War II. And, these kids are the great grandchildren of this woman who took my grandmother. And I got to go with them to school and, talk to their class. And it's like through our friendship, like this history is just present. And that's been a total gift that I did not anticipate going into this work at all.
Right. It's hard to understand that kind of connection unless you've been through it. I recently, somebody contacted me, and his father was standing online, a little bit behind my father at Auschwitz when they got numbered. And he read an article I wrote, and I don't know him, but I do now. There's just this great connection that our fathers were online in the same point in history from a transport. And I just had that one connection. You have this whole world out there.
I like to think that these connections keep coming once you open yourself up to them.
Absolutely.
I think that's the beauty of, why do we retell history over and over? Why do we retell these stories? I mean, since you asked earlier about the feedback from the podcast and the book, one of the greatest gift I've gotten is that I get people who write me all the time and tell me their stories, or, I'll be out at I don't know, a bar at a friend's house, wherever. And somebody will ask me what I do. And, it's like, I'll tiptoe into it. And eventually, once I tell people what I do, everybody wants to talk about their family history. And it's a really beautiful thing, particularly because before the podcast came out, I have to say this was like an incredibly lonely project to work on. I mean, now it's really nice because the story is known, and I can have conversations with you and with other individuals who feel connected, and it's this sense of community.
Right.
But this work can be really lonely, and so it's just really nice when everyone starts talking about where they come from, and we all get to share that.
Right. And especially at this point in our lives when, we went through the COVID quarantine, and, life isn't still fully back to normal, to have connections with people, even if you don't see them, it's an important, being connected with people is important. And I think that's a big part of your grandmother's story, that she had these connections, and she did not dwell on, where she could have, the horrors that she went through. She focused and taught you about the joy of living.
Yeah, I will. And I will say that, you know, she certainly she carried all of the heaviness. She didn't, I don't think she burdened us with it, but the beginning of the book actually starts with her survivor's guilt and how that manifested at a certain part of her life, and in a really scary way, because it started coming out when I was around 13. So, you know, I don't think I understood what it was then, but as an adult, thinking about what she was going through, now understanding, I mean, I didn't understand what the Holocaust was at 13. Even if I knew what it was, I didn't understand what it was. And, you know, I think that's also something very interesting about her, is that it's very clear from her writings. It's very clear from this, like, you know, obsessiveness I've had with her story in the past 12 years. I can very much see that she carried it deeply, and there's no question about that. But it wasn't something that she, I would say, burdened us with. And I think about that a lot more, you know,
Sure.
more and more and more as the years go on, you know, and that's why I said, like, you know, I'd love to ask her about what it felt to hold it, because I don't think I knew to ask that then.
No, of course not. And if I remember correctly, out of all the grandchildren, you and your brother did not live in close proximity to her. So in addition to you being the photojournalist, you know, your other cousins, her other grandchildren, probably saw her from time to time, and there's not necessarily that big a need to ask somebody the questions and sit down and tell me your life story if you see them from time to time. You know, just really sort of worked for you that you were the grandchild that is a holder of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, she was the babysitter for the other cousins, but she actually writes in her diaries that, like, visiting me and my brother was like tourism. And so, you know, I think maybe that's why when we sat down for her to tell me her story, it felt like traveling. You know, and she loved to travel, and she knew I loved to travel. And, you know, she talked to me in a way that I knew how to listen. You know, she talked to me at where I was at. And when I was 20 years old and curious, I had the travel bug. I didn't want to be in school, and I wanted to be all over the world with my camera, and she knew how to get my attention. And so that's why I say she's a gifted storyteller.
And very insightful.
Yes, very, very insightful. Absolutely. And I like to think that the book is as much her words as it is mine.
Yeah. Well, yes, you know, it is her words, your perspective on her words, her impact on your life. It's just really come full circle. Rachel, it's been a pleasure talking with you. We've spoken before on the phone, and have a great connection, and seeing you in person, so to speak, it's been great. And I thank you very much for your time. And I thank Ari and everyone else in the museum for all the wonderful programs that you do, and for hosting Rachael tonight.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Ari, and thank you to everybody who came this evening. Really appreciate it.
I echo your thanks. This was such a poignant intergenerational discussion, and a beautiful tribute to your grandmother and her experience, Rachael. You can order We Share the Same Sky, a Memoir of Memory and Migration by Rachael Cerrotti at the link in the Zoom chat, as well as explore her website to see her podcast and some of her other work. This evening's program is part of a series of programs we host each quarter at the museum with Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, run by Ellen Bachner Greenberg and Eva Fogelman. We hope if you are a descendant of Holocaust survivors, you'll check out the group and get involved. The link to the Descendants of Holocaust Survivors Facebook group is in the Zoom chat. Everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support as well. So if you're moved by this evening's discussion, we hope you'll make a contribution to the museum and continue to stay involved in our programs and events. You're already on our email list if you're at this evening's program, so stay posted tomorrow for an email from us with a recording of this evening's discussion and a heads up about some other things that we have on the horizon. Rachael, Ellen, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure.